Let's see if we hear the same affirmation after this sermon. It may be a yay, he's finally finished. Listen for God's word as it comes from the hand of the Apostle Paul as he writes to the church in Corinth, Greece. It's his first letter, 1 Corinthians, the 13th chapter. I am beginning to read at the first verse. Listen, this is God's word. If I speak in tongues of human beings and of angels, but I don't have love, I'm a clanging gong or a clashing cymbal. If I have the gift of prophecy and I know all the mysteries and everything else, and if I have such complete faith that I can move mountains, but I don't have love, I'm nothing. If I give away everything that I have and hand over my body to feel good about what I've done, but I don't have love, I receive no benefit whatsoever. Love is patient. Love is kind. It isn't jealous. It doesn't brag. It isn't arrogant. It isn't rude. It doesn't seek its own advantage. It isn't irritable. It doesn't keep a record of complaints. It isn't happy with injustice, but it is happy with the truth. Love puts up with all things. Love trusts in all things. Love hopes for all things. Love endures all things. Love never fails. God's holy word. There is a delightful story of a young child who asked his Sunday school teacher if she would explain to him what heaven is like. And she struggled, as any of us would, to explain the inexplicable. She was patient. She was tender to the child and did the very best job that she could do to explain what heaven is like. The child thanked his Sunday school teacher and then went home and said, "Mom, I don't want to go to heaven." "Well, why is that, sweetheart?" "Because apparently, according to my Sunday school teacher, heaven doesn't have escalators. Department stores have escalators. I want to go to the department store when I die instead of heaven." Well, it's a delightful story, but unfortunately, perhaps sadly, it seems that many adults today are not concerned about going to heaven as well. Phil and Heather Toffel, who are present in worship this morning, sent me this summer an electronic copy of an article that appeared in the Atlantic Monthly. It is an article that discusses why worship attendance has precipitously declined across our nation. It seems that people are not interested in faith anymore, or at least they're not interested in the church. They are like the little boy. They believe all the good stuff can be found somewhere else than in church. The boy doesn't want to go to heaven because it doesn't have escalators. The good stuff is found in the department store. They have given up on the church. As you heard from Greg, that during my vacation with my wife in Europe, this presbytery of which we are a part, the Presbytery of Tropical Florida, closed a congregation. And Greg and Darius Butina, the general presbyter of our presbytery, preached the final worship service for that congregation. In the next 2 weeks, Darius Butina will preach the final worship service for a second congregation in this presbytery. And likely by the end of this year, we'll preach the final worship service for a third congregation in this presbytery. We are now the First Presbyterian Church of Delray Beach, the largest church in the Presbytery of Tropical Florida. We are a vibrant congregation, but congregations across South Florida and throughout the nation are beginning to lose vibrancy, and churches are closing. They're closing their doors for the lack of interest. My wife and I traveled to Europe 2 weeks ago and took a river cruise from Amsterdam to Antwerp, Belgium. It has been on her bucket list for 36 years, and finally we were able to accomplish it. And it was a marvelous experience. I have wanted to go to Belgium for 36 years because Belgium is where my wife's birth certificate was issued. Yes, you do understand correctly that she was born in Africa, but when she was born in Zaire, it was a province of Belgium. So it was Belgium that issued her birth certificate, and I wanted to travel to that nation where her birth certificate is filed. One day we spent in Ghent, Belgium, and we had a young woman in her late 20s as our guide. And as she was leading us through downtown Ghent, she shared this. Ghent had 47 churches. In the downtown area and the residential area that surrounded the downtown, 47 churches, but 35 have closed. Only 12 remain faith communities with an average worship attendance of 15 to 25 on a Sunday morning. Of the 35 congregations that have closed, one has been converted into a large bookstore. Grace and I went into this bookstore. It looks like a Barnes & Noble. And in the chancel area, that had been converted to a coffee house and cafe. Now, those of you who know me know that I cannot get enough coffee. And I was so wanting a cappuccino at that time, but I did not buy a coffee, only because I could not buy a coffee in a space that at one time was a holy, sacred space. The stained glass windows were still in the windows. The chancel area looked like a chancel area with a beautiful stained glass window as we have, but it was now a bookstore and a coffee house. Other congregations that have closed have been converted into an expensive hotel, into a bicycle parking lot, into a very upscale restaurant. One has turned into a grocery store. People buy their groceries surrounded by lovely stained glass windows. Many of them have been turned into nightclubs for those who are in their 20s and 30s. The Christian church is struggling throughout this nation and around the world. So I did not want to tell our guide that I was a pastor. I did not want to in any way taint her response to my question. I asked in front of the other tourists who she was leading, do you have an opinion as to why church attendance has dropped so precipitously? Do you have an opinion as to why 35 churches have closed their doors and have now been repurposed? She was very polite and civil but direct. I'm 28 years old. All of my life, I've paid attention to those who go to church. I've never seen in them what faith looks like. But I've listened to them, and what I've heard simply wasn't very attractive. Paul would say that love went silent in the city of Ghent. Paul would say that love is in danger of going silent across this nation and around the world. Because as she said, I look at those who go to church and I simply do not see what the faith looks like. But when I listen to them, what I hear is not very attractive. Paul shares with us in these few verses from the 13th chapter of 1 Corinthians what love looks like. The first thing that Paul mentions is that love is faith in action. Faith is something that we see in action through those who confess to be disciples of Jesus Christ. We are called Christians, and Christians literally mean little Christ. We are to behave and speak as if we are Christ's self. How are you doing in that department? Many of you know who Shaq O'Neal is, who is a basketball player with the National Basketball Association. And when Shaq O'Neal received his first MPV award some years ago, he gave himself a nickname. He says, I am the big Aristotle. The big Aristotle. He was asked to explain. He said, well, Aristotle, the great philosopher, once said that excellence is not a single event. It is a habit. It is what we do repeatedly. I am the big Aristotle, for I repeatedly seek excellence in my life. Well, if my tour guide in Ghent were to watch your life over a period of time and to listen to the words that come from your lips, what would she see? Would she see Christ? Or would she hear words that make the Christian faith unattractive? Greg read just a minute ago some words from the Apostle Paul to the church in Philippi, Philippians. And those words simply said that we have a choice. When we speak, we have a choice. We can point out the flaws and the deficiencies and the inadequacies of other people, or we can choose to focus on what is lovely and admirable and holy. And then Paul urges us to do the latter. Whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, whatever is holy about that person, speak of that and lift it up. How are you doing in that department? When you speak of others, does love go silent? It goes silent if you are critical. But love is heard loud and clear if whatever is lovely and admirable and holy comes from your lips. During this river cruise on the Viking riverboat, the restaurant, and that is the name of the dining hall, the restaurant, they have tables for 6 and 8 and 10 and 12. A couple cannot have a private meal. You're forced to have a meal with other people. I loved it. I'm an introvert. I don't gravitate toward other people in that way. On one morning for breakfast, Grace and I were the first at this particular table that sat 8 people. And then a young man about my children's age came and he sat across from us, and naturally we introduced ourselves to each other. And then as his breakfast was placed in front of him by the server, he bowed his head and he offered a blessing. This is a man about my children's age, and he quietly offered a blessing over his meal. I was intrigued, and I said, Joel, are you traveling with anyone? He was seated by himself. He said, I'm traveling with my mother and father. They're celebrating their anniversary. They asked me to celebrate with them. I don't know anybody on this boat except for my mom and my dad. But Joel, I just saw that you offered a prayer over your breakfast. Would you talk to me about that? And he said, I'm a man of faith. Jesus is my Lord. I never eat without first thanking God and asking God's blessing over the meal I'm to receive. I wish that 29-year-old tour guide in Ghent could have been at breakfast that morning. She would have seen faith in action. Paul says that we are called to put our faith in action and to live it habitually in such a way that people who watch us can see that we are little Christ. If we don't, love goes silent and churches are closed. Secondly, the Apostle Paul tells us that love is non-judgmental and accepting. Non-judgmental and accepting. In a former congregation that I served, I was privileged when I began as the pastor to meet 2 little girls who were in elementary school. And I was pleased to watch them grow up and then go to high school. You who are parents understand that there is a fundamental change in our children when they go to high school, particularly, and perhaps I'm being biased here, particularly for daughters. For you see, my daughter adored me when she was in elementary school. You know what happened when she went to high school. She wanted to pretend that she didn't have parents, that somehow she just popped into existence. If I were to drop her off at high school for some reason, I needed to park down the street and she would walk. Or there are two adorable girls who were friends when I became the pastor of that church in elementary school, and I watched them grow, and every Sunday they would come and embrace me warmly until they got to high school. One Sunday after they were in high school, they were wrestling with what anybody who begins high school wrestles with: managing other people's perception of them as they struggle to know who they were themselves. These two ladies were very tall, and they wore lovely dresses that I heard from many, many people were entirely too short. Someone actually came to my office and said there were a lot of legs in church that morning, wasn't there? But I had people come to my office and say, Doug, you need to talk to them about appropriate dress for church. And I said, I will not. My job is to show them Jesus, and that is your job as well. Do not speak to them about their dress. Show them Jesus. They did not, and love went silent. And since their pastor wouldn't speak to them, they did. And for the rest of my ministry, they never came back to church. It was more important how they dressed to these people than the fact that they were actually in church, hearing the gospel proclaimed for their lives. Love goes silent when we are judgmental of other people, and when we are unaccepting of other people because we don't agree with their lifestyle. Love goes silent. We are called to accept everyone who wants to be a part of this faith community, and to love them deeply and to show them Jesus. And if there's something about their lifestyle or the way in which they are living that we disagree with, you can lift it up to God in prayer silently. Let Jesus take care of it. It is Jesus' problem, if it's a problem at all, not ours. Finally, here in the 13th chapter of 1 Corinthians, Paul tells us that love is wrapped in humility. If you are honest with yourself, if I'm honest with myself, we all will acknowledge that we are where we are in life because of others who've gone before us, and that we stand on their shoulders. There is a wonderful true story of a distinguished professor at the University of Chicago who quite often was visited in his office by his granddaughter, who was preschool. And she always enjoyed taking the hand of her granddaddy and walking with him across the campus of the University of Chicago. But on one particular day, Granddaddy lifted the granddaughter up and put her on his shoulders, and as they were walking across the campus, one of the professors who had seen her just a week earlier said, my, have you grown in a week? Can you imagine what this little girl said? She said, this isn't all me. I'm sitting on someone's shoulders. Every one of us sit or stand on the shoulders of other people. If I have been effective as your pastor for the past 11 years, it's because I followed Ted Bush, who handed over to his successor a healthy and vibrant congregation. I also know that I am the man today that I am, and I'm the pastor today that I am because of my wife. My wife has been more than a support. She has built me up to be the person and the professional that I am. And I'm grateful to her, for I would not be who I am without her. I have a book coming out in about 6 weeks to 8 weeks entitled A Month of Prayer. I sent a manuscript to Kiani Richardson, and she wrote a few words for the back cover. I sent a copy to Michael Brown, and he wrote a few words for the back cover. And Michael Brown said to me, I see that you asked your associate pastor, Greg Rapier, to write the foreword. You really honored him by doing that. And I said, oh, Michael, you got it just the reverse. I know that this man who is my colleague in ministry will one day, past my retirement, be one of the most distinguished pastors in our denomination. And I simply want to say, in that day in the future, that this year he wrote the foreword to a book I wrote. I believe that the most effective years of my ministry, 36 in all, have been the past 5 years because I've had the privilege of serving in ministry with Greg Rapier. But not only Greg, you have a strong staff. Part-time and full-time, you have a strong staff. I'm including those who sit in the nursery. I'm including those who are working the audio-visual right now in our sound booth. So if you pick up a copy of this book when it comes available in 6 to 8 weeks, you will read that I've dedicated the book to the staff of this church, and I've mentioned everyone by name. For I sit upon their shoulders. And they are the reason that we are now the largest church in the Presbytery of Tropical Florida. The Apostle Paul tells us that if we are to put faith in action, we are to understand that we sit or stand on the shoulders of others, and we are to have the humility to give credit where credit is due. If we don't, love becomes silent and churches close. So these three things, Paul says. Your faith must be one that is an action where people see it repeatedly. They see that you stand apart from all the others because of how you speak about others and how you live. That they see that you're accepting of everyone and not judgmental in any way. And that you have the humility to recognize that you've done nothing, absolutely nothing by yourself. That you stand or sit on the shoulders of others. It's when we do that that we go from vibrancy to vibrancy to vibrancy as the Church of Jesus Christ. Amen.